The clang of the gate echoed through the restricted section, and a sudden, suffocating stillness settled over the air. The faint glow of the wards dimmed as the magic within them dissipated completely, leaving only an eerie silence in their wake. "What's going on?" I whispered, my voice trembling as the oppressive sensation pressed down on us. Clara clutched the black book to her chest, her face pale. "It's the anti-magic field," she murmured. "Some parts of the restricted section are enchanted to neutralize all spells, probably as a safeguard." "Neutralize all spells?" I repeated, my stomach twisting. Before I could say anything more, I felt it, a strange, tingling sensation that spread over my skin, almost like pins and needles. It was gone as quickly as it had come, leaving me feeling different. Lighter. Realer. I looked down at my hands, and my heart nearly stopped. They were bigger, rougher, my hands. My old hands. The ones I hadn't seen since Professor Ashtorn had changed me into Jessica. I stumbled back, staring at my reflection in the polished metal base of a nearby lantern. My face stared back at me, not Jessica's face, but Nolan's. My heart raced as I looked down, realizing with no small amount of mortification that while I was back in my original body, I was still wearing Jessica's frilly pink nightgown. "This can't be happening," I muttered, tugging at the hem of the too-short gown. The delicate fabric barely reached the tops of my thighs, and the bows on the straps now felt absurdly out of place. "Clara!" I called, turning toward her. "Something's happening, I'm back to being me." But Clara didn't respond. She darted around the corner of a bookshelf the moment the gate had sealed, her movements quick and uncharacteristically clumsy. "Clara?" I called again, my voice rising slightly. "I'm fine," Clara said, though her voice sounded strange, deeper, rougher, like it was coming from someone else entirely. I frowned, stepping cautiously toward the corner of the shelf. "Clara, are you sure? You sound..." I said I'm fine. She snapped, her tone sharper than I'd ever heard it. I stopped, my concern mounting. "What's going on? Why won't you come out?" There was a long pause, followed by a muffled sound, almost like fabric ripping. Then, slowly, Clara stepped out from behind the shelf. My jaw dropped. Clara was no longer the girl I'd been planning this wild revenge with. Instead, she stood taller, much taller, her frame broader, her face sharper, and her voice unmistakably masculine. She was now a teen boy, his short brown hair slightly mussed, his shoulders awkwardly hunched as he tugged at the pink nightgown that now barely fit over his larger body. The hem, which had once reached Clara's knees, now stopped mid-thigh, and the fabric strained awkwardly against his broader chest and shoulders. "What the?" I stammered, unable to find the words. Clara, or whoever he was now, sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, okay. This is definitely not how I saw tonight going." "Clara?" I asked, my voice rising in disbelief. "Still me," he muttered, though his deeper voice made the words jarring. "I think." I stared, unable to process what I was seeing. The anti-magic field had undone Clara's change too, but instead of returning to her usual self, she'd become someone entirely different, a boy who looked like he belonged in a completely different year group. The clock struck another time, and I realized just how precarious our situation had become, trapped in the restricted section, stripped of our magic, and both of us in ridiculous nightgowns that no longer fit right. We were in more trouble than ever. Clara, or rather, the boy standing before me, sighed heavily and sank to the floor of the library, his broad shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had finally caught up with him. The pink nightgown strained awkwardly over his larger frame, the delicate bows and ruffles looking utterly out of place. "I guess there's no point hiding it anymore," he muttered, his voice low and rough. "You deserve to know the truth." I stared at him, still trying to reconcile the confident, mischievous Clara I knew with the boy sitting before me. "What are you talking about? What truth?" He leaned back against the bookshelf, running a hand through his short brown hair. "First off, I lied. I don't have an older brother." "What?" I asked, frowning. "Then how do you know all those spells?" "The duplication charm," the anti-magic tricks. He waved a hand dismissively. I learned them myself, over the years. Had to. It was the only way to survive in this place. Survive what? I asked, sitting down across from him. He took a deep breath, his expression shadowed. My name isn't Clara. It's Daniel. I was a freshman here. Years ago. And I screwed up, big time. I blinked, surprised by the sudden shift in tone. What do you mean? Clara, whatever his name was, rubbed his face with his hands, as if trying to steel himself. There's a spell, he began. A forbidden one. I thought I was clever enough to use it, thought I could control it. I was showing off, trying to impress some older students, but I botched it. Badly. What happened? I asked cautiously. He let out a bitter laugh. Let's just say it was big enough that the school wanted to take away my powers entirely. They were ready to expel me and strip me of my magic, but they offered me a choice, lose my powers and live as a mortal, or, start over. Start over? I echoed, my mind racing. He nodded, his expression tightening. Redo my entire magical education, from kindergarten onward. But there was a catch. My parents got to decide what form I'd take when I started over, and… He trailed off, gesturing to himself. They thought I'd learn more empathy if I had to do it as a girl. My jaw dropped. You've been a girl this whole time? Just because of that? For years, he said, his voice tinged with frustration. I've had to live this life, pretending to be Clara, pretending everything was fine while I relearned all the basics, potions, charms, transformations. All of it. I stared at him, my mind reeling. But why didn't you tell anyone? Why go along with it? He looked at me, his eyes serious. Because if I didn't, they'd take away my powers for good. And I couldn't let that happen. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The library seemed even quieter, the silence pressing down on us as I tried to process everything he just said. So, I said finally, my voice hesitant. You've been living as a girl, redoing school all this time. And no one knows? Daniel shook his head. No one. Not until now. I didn't think I'd ever tell anyone, but, I guess being stuck in this anti-magic field kind of forces the truth out, doesn't it? I nodded slowly, my own situation suddenly feeling a little less unique. You've been through a lot. You have no idea, he muttered, resting his head back against the bookshelf. I sat quietly for a moment, watching him. The confident, clever Clara I'd known was still there, but now I could see the exhaustion behind his bravado, the years of hiding, pretending, and trying to make the best of a situation he never wanted. Well, I said finally, a faint smile tugging at my lips. At least now I know why you're so good at spells. Years of extra practice, huh? Daniel chuckled, a small, genuine laugh that broke through the tension. Yeah. I guess you could say that. Despite everything, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. For the first time since this whole mess started, I wasn't the only one carrying a secret. And somehow, that made all the difference. The air in the restricted section remained heavy, the lingering effects of the anti-magic field pressing down on us. Daniel paced back and forth, his too small nightgown looking increasingly absurd as he muttered to himself. There has to be a way out, he said, his voice low and determined. The gate's sealed, sure, but it's not permanent. These spells are designed to reset, there's always an override. I leaned against one of the shelves, still trying to process everything he told me. And you're sure we can't just wait it out? Daniel shook his head. Midnight lockdowns don't lift until the morning bell. We'd be stuck here for hours, and that's if no one finds us first. That's less than ideal, I muttered. He smirked faintly, though there was still tension in his voice. Yeah, I figured you wouldn't want to spend the rest of the night trapped in here, either. He crouched near the base of the gate, his fingers tracing the intricate runes carved into the iron bars. These are the key, he murmured. The enchantments on the gate are tied to the field. If I can disrupt the right rune, the lock should release without triggering any alarms. How are you going to do that without magic? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Daniel grinned, pulling a small pocket knife from somewhere inside the frilly folds of his too small nightgown. Who said anything about magic? I blinked. Do I want to know why you're carrying that? It's useful, he said simply, flicking the blade open. And it's not technically against the rules. I wasn't entirely convinced, but I didn't argue as he set to work, carefully scraping away at one of the runes. The metal flared faintly, the glow dimming as the rune's energy dissipated. Almost there, he muttered, his focus razor sharp. With one final scrape, there was a soft click, and the gate swung open a few inches. Got it? Daniel said triumphantly, stepping back. Come on, let's go before anyone notices. We slipped through the gate, the cool air of the library hitting me like a wave of relief. But as soon as we crossed the threshold, the weight of the anti-magic field lifted, and with it, something shifted. That familiar tingling sensation spread over my skin again, and I glanced down to see my hands shrinking, softening. My body changed rapidly, and within moments, I was back to being Jessica, her soft features and slender frame unmistakable. Oh, come on, I muttered, tugging at the nightgown that now fit me perfectly again. Beside me, Daniel groaned, his voice rising into the familiar pitch of Clara's. I turned to see her, or him? Transforming back, the broad shoulders narrowing and the masculine features melting away into the soft, rounded face of the girl I'd known. Great, Clara muttered, her voice laced with frustration as she adjusted the straps of her now fitting nightgown. Guess we're back to this. Looks like it, I said, sighing. What now? Clara pulled Emma's wand from her pocket, a determined glint in her eye. Now, we make sure no one sees or hears us. She pointed the wand at me and muttered the invisibility incantation. The same golden glow wrapped around me as before, and I vanished from sight. Clara quickly cast the same spell on herself, followed by the mute spell. There, she whispered, her voice clear only to me. Back to being unseen and unheard. Let's get out of here, I said, my voice trembling slightly. The weight of what had just happened, and what was still ahead, pressed heavily on my mind. Clara nodded, her invisible form shimmering faintly in the dim light. Together, we slipped out of the library, the night stretching ahead of us once more. The dormitory was quiet when Clara and I slipped back inside, our invisible forms moving soundlessly through the rows of bunks. Most of the girls were fast asleep, their soft breathing the only sound in the room. The faint glow of enchanted lanterns lit the way as we made our way toward the bathroom, the weight of the black book and Emma's wand heavy between us. Once inside the bathroom, Clara locked the door and set the book on the counter. I dropped the invisibility spell, relieved to finally see myself again, even if it was as Jessica. Clara followed suit, her form flickering back into view as she adjusted her nightgown. Okay, she said, flipping the book open to the page she'd marked earlier. The title of the spell, Regression of Form, Infantile States, glimmered in gold across the top of the page. This is it? I asked, leaning closer. Clara nodded, scanning the dense text. This is it. It's complicated, but nothing I can't handle. I'll need a clear view of Emma and a few uninterrupted seconds to cast it. What happens after? I asked, my stomach twisting with nervous energy. She won't even know what hit her, Clara said, smirking faintly as she studied the incantation. The spell's temporary, but she'll spend the next few hours as a helpless little baby. Serves her right. Despite everything, I hesitated. Are you sure about this? What if? Clara placed a hand on my shoulder, her expression softening. Jessica, she did this to you. She deserves to know what it feels like to be powerless, to have everything taken away. We're just evening the score. I nodded slowly, the memory of Emma's smug grin earlier that night pushing away my doubts. Clara spent a few more minutes memorizing the incantation, muttering the words under her breath until she was confident. Then she snapped the book shut, tucking it under her arm. Let's do this, she whispered. We crept back into the dormitory, moving slowly and carefully through the rows of sleeping girls. Emma's bed was near the center of the room, her figure barely visible under the soft pink blanket. Her bag sat at the foot of her bed, the faint shimmer of its enchanted fabric catching the dim light. Clara crouched beside the bed, her movements deliberate as she slipped the black book into Emma's bag. She positioned it just beneath a stack of clothes, ensuring it would look like Emma had taken it from the library herself. Then, with practiced precision, she pulled out Emma's wand, the real one, and replaced it with the duplicate. The two were identical in every way, and I marveled again at Clara's skill with the duplication spell. "Ready?" Clara whispered, glancing up at me. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. Clara stood, her hand steady as she pointed Emma's real wand at the sleeping figure beneath the blanket. She muttered the incantation softly, her voice barely audible as the wand began to glow. The golden light spread over Emma like a blanket, pulsing faintly as it worked its magic. Emma stirred slightly, her expression scrunching in confusion before her form began to shrink. Clara lowered the wand, watching as the transformation completed. Within seconds, the once smug 10-year-old was gone, replaced by a tiny, chubby-cheeked baby nestled in the middle of the bed. Clara grinned, tucking the wand into her Emma's bag. "And that," she whispered, "is how you teach someone a lesson." We stood there for a moment, staring at the sleeping infant who had once been our tormentor. For the first time all weekend, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. "Let's get back to bed," Clara said, pulling me gently away. "We'd done what we needed to do." As we slipped back into our bunks, the dormitory silent around us, I couldn't help but wonder what the morning would bring. One thing was certain, Emma wouldn't be laughing anymore. The dormitory was still bathed in the dim light of the pre-dawn hour when a shrill, piercing cry shattered the silence. I sat bolt upright in my bunk, my heart racing as the wailing continued. Around me, the other girls stirred, groaning and mumbling in confusion. "What is that?" someone muttered sleepily. "Is that a baby?" another voice asked, bewildered. Clara shot me a glance from her bunk, her expression a mix of amusement and feigned innocence. "Guess she woke up," she whispered, smirking. The crying grew louder, and the sound of shuffling blankets and groggy murmurs filled the room as the girls started climbing out of bed to investigate. I hesitated, torn between staying where I was and joining the growing crowd gathering near Emma's bed. My heart pounded as I swung my legs over the side of the bunk, the cool floor sending a shiver through me. Clara was already up, tugging at her nightgown as she joined the group of curious onlookers. "What's going on?" one of the girls asked, rubbing her eyes. "I don't know," another said, craning her neck to see over the others. When I reached the center of the commotion, I saw her, or rather, what was left of her. Emma, now an infant no older than a few months, lay in the middle of her bed, her tiny face scrunched up as she wailed loudly. Her pink blanket was bunched around her, and her chubby little fists flailed in the air as she kicked her legs. The dorm erupted into chaos. "Is that a baby? Where did she come from? Is that Emma's bed?" Clara covered her mouth with her hand, hiding her grin as she leaned closer to me. "This is better than I imagined," she whispered. "Keep it together," I hissed back, my nerves fraying as the scene unfolded. "What's going on here?" The sharp voice of Mrs. Yomi cut through the noise, silencing the room in an instant. The dorm's supervisor stood in the doorway, her stern expression scanning the crowd of girls before her eyes fell on the source of the commotion. Her eyebrows shot up as she took in the sight of the crying infant. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded. None of the girls spoke, their wide eyes darting between each other and the baby on the bed. Mrs. Yomi marched over to Emma's bed, her heels clicking sharply against the stone floor. She picked up the baby carefully, her movements precise as she cradled Emma in her arms. "Who is this child, and how did she get here?" Mrs. Yomi asked, her tone icy. Clara stepped closer to me, her voice barely a whisper. "The book and the wand are in her bag. If they look, it'll all point back to her." I nodded, my pulse racing. The plan had worked, but the morning was far from over. Mrs. Yomi turned to face the room, her expression severe. "No one leaves the storm until we get to the bottom of this," she said firmly. "Whoever is responsible for this will have to answer to the headmaster." Clara shot me a subtle, reassuring smile. "Just stay calm," she murmured. "We've got this," but as the other girls began murmuring nervously, I couldn't help but wonder if the chaos was just beginning. Mrs. Yomi's voice cut through the commotion like a knife. "You?" she said, pointing to one of the older girls, a tall witch with curly brown hair. "Go fetch Professor Ashtorn immediately!" The girl nodded quickly, her face pale, and hurried out of the dormitory without a word. "As for the rest of you," Mrs. Yomi continued, her tone cold and commanding, "line up against the far wall. Now!" The dormitory fell silent, save for the soft sniffles of the infant cradled in Mrs. Yomi's arms. The girls moved hesitantly, their expressions a mix of confusion and fear as they shuffled toward the designated wall. Clara and I exchanged a quick glance, her expression calm and composed while my heart pounded in my chest. We joined the others, standing shoulder to shoulder near the far end of the room. Mrs. Yomi paced in front of us, her sharp eyes scanning the line. "I want to know who is responsible for this," she said firmly, holding up the still sniffling baby for emphasis. "A child does not simply appear in the middle of my dormitory. Someone here knows what happened." The girls murmured softly, glancing at one another nervously. No one dared to speak up. Clara leaned slightly toward me, her voice so quiet only I could hear. "Just keep your head down," she whispered. "This will all work out." I nodded, trying to match her confidence, though my hands clenched into fists at my sides. Mrs. Yomi stopped pacing, turning to glare at us with an expression that could have turned someone to stone. "You will remain here until Professor Ashtorn arrives. And if no one confesses by then, rest assured the consequences will be severe." The weight of her words hung heavily in the air as the dormitory door creaked open, and the girl who'd been sent to fetch Professor Ashtorn returned. "She's on her way," the girl said nervously, stepping aside. Mrs. Yomi nodded curtly, her gaze flickering back to the line of girls. "Good! Until she gets here, I suggest you all think very carefully about whether you have anything to share." As we waited in tense silence, the only sound in the room was the soft cooing of the baby in Mrs. Yomi's arms. Clara stood beside me, her expression unreadable, but I could feel the tension radiating off her. All we could do now was wait, and hope the plan held up under scrutiny. The tension in the dormitory was suffocating by the time Professor Ashtorn arrived. She swept into the room with her dark robes billowing behind her, her sharp gaze immediately assessing the line of nervous girls pressed against the wall. "Good morning, Mrs. Yomi," she said briskly, her voice low but commanding. "I understand there's been an incident." Mrs. Yomi nodded, her expression grave as she gestured to the cooing infant in her arms. "This child appeared in the dormitory during the night. None of the girls will admit to knowing anything about it." Professor Ashtorn's piercing eyes flicked to the girls. "I see! Very well! Let's get to the bottom of this!" She stepped forward, her presence casting a long shadow over the room. "Wands," she said sharply. "All of you, call for your wands!" The girls glanced at one another hesitantly before raising their hands and speaking the incantation, Vocare Baculum. A faint hum filled the air as wands flew from trunks, bags, and bedside tables, zipping through the room like small, obedient birds before landing neatly in their owners' hands. Clara and I followed suit, our wands flying to us without hesitation. Professor Ashtorn narrowed her eyes, stepping forward as she waved her own wand in a series of deliberate motions. "Inspection spell," she murmured. A soft golden light enveloped each wand in the room, its glow revealing the magical history etched into the wood. Professor Ashtorn moved down the line, scanning each wand carefully as the golden script floated briefly in the air before fading away. One by one, she inspected the wands, her expression neutral as she found nothing out of the ordinary. When she reached Clara, my heart skipped a beat, but the script on her wand revealed nothing suspicious, just the spells cast before dinner. "Well, well," Professor Ashtorn said, raising an eyebrow at Clara. "Nothing unusual here." Clara gave a small, innocent nod, her face calm and unreadable. When the line was finished, Professor Ashtorn turned back to Mrs. Yomi. "All clear." Mrs. Yomi frowned. "Then where did the magic come from?" Professor Ashtorn's sharp eyes swept the room, her gaze landing on Emma's bed. "Perhaps the answer lies elsewhere," she said. She strode over to Emma's bag, still sitting neatly at the foot of her bed. With a flick of her wand, the bag opened, revealing its contents: a stack of folded clothes, a potion vial, and the black book Clara and I had placed inside. Professor Ashtorn's eyes narrowed as she reached for the book, her fingers brushing the glowing sigil on its cover. "Interesting," she murmured, holding it up for the room to see. "A restricted book, taken from the library. And who does this bag belong to?" Mrs. Yomi's lips tightened. "Emma, Professor." Professor Ashtorn's expression grew colder. "Let's see what her wand has to say, shall we?" She reached into the bag and pulled out the wand, the real one Clara had carefully switched back. Holding it aloft, she repeated the inspection spell. Golden script flared into the air, brighter and more vivid than before. The words hung there like damning evidence: regression of form, infantile states. A gasp rippled through the girls lined against the wall. "Well, well," Professor Ashtorn said, her voice cutting through the noise like ice. "It seems Emma's wand has quite the story to tell." Mrs. Yomi's expression hardened, and she adjusted the baby in her arms. "What would you have me do, Professor?" Professor Ashtorn gave a thin, humorless smile. "Take the child to the infirmary for now. I'll handle the rest." As Mrs. Yomi left the room with the infant, the other girls murmured softly, their voices a mixture of shock and confusion. Clara stood quietly beside me, her expression calm, though I could feel the faint tension radiating from her. Professor Ashtorn turned back to the girls. "You're dismissed, for now," she said sharply. "Except for you two." Her gaze locked on Clara and me. My heart sank as the other girls filed out, leaving the two of us alone with Professor Ashtorn in the now silent dormitory. The dormitory was eerily quiet as the door closed behind the last of the girls, leaving Clara and me alone with Professor Ashtorn. Her dark eyes swept over us, sharp and calculating, as if she could read every secret we were desperately trying to keep hidden. She didn't speak at first, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably as she paced in front of us. Her presence was commanding, her movements deliberate, and my heart pounded in my chest with every click of her boots against the stone floor. "Interesting," she said finally, her tone low and measured. "Two students caught in the restricted section yesterday, meddling with books they shouldn't have been touching." My stomach dropped. Professor Ashtorn stopped in front of us, folding her arms as she looked between Clara and me. And now, barely a day later, another restricted book turns up, this time in Emma's possession. Coincidence? She arched a brow. Perhaps. Clara kept her face carefully neutral, though I could see the faint flicker of tension in her jaw. "We were punished for being in the restricted section," she said evenly. "And we've done nothing since." "Have you?" Professor Ashtorn asked, her voice laced with skepticism. She turned her gaze to me, and I felt as though she could see straight through me. "And what about you, Jessica? Nothing to share?" I shook my head quickly, my palms damp with sweat. "No, Professor. Nothing." She hummed thoughtfully, her eyes narrowing. "Curious, isn't it? Two girls caught in the library with a forbidden book one day, and the next, Emma is reduced to infancy, her wand marked with the very same forbidden magic. You two were so eager to learn about." Clara opened her mouth to respond, but Professor Ashtorn held up a hand, silencing her. "I have no proof, of course," she continued, her voice cool and deliberate. "Your wands tell a tidy story, no forbidden spells, no tampering. But one thing I've learned in my years as a teacher is this: there's no such thing as a coincidence in a school of magic." Clara shifted slightly, her calm exterior cracking just enough for me to notice. Professor Ashtorn leaned closer, her dark eyes boring into us. "I don't know how you did it," she said softly, "but mark my words, I will find out." A chill ran down my spine as she straightened, her expression cold and unreadable. "For now," she said, stepping back, "you may return to your day. But I advise you both to tread carefully. The truth always has a way of revealing itself, no matter how cleverly it's concealed." She turned on her heel, her robes billowing as she strode toward the door. Just before leaving, she glanced over her shoulder, her gaze lingering on us for a moment longer. "Curious indeed," she said softly, almost to herself, before disappearing into the hallway. The door closed with a heavy click, and the silence in the dormitory felt suffocating. Clara let out a slow breath, her shoulders slumping slightly as the tension drained from her. "That was close." "Too close," I muttered, my legs feeling like jelly as I sank onto the edge of my bunk. Clara sat beside me, her expression thoughtful. "She doesn't have proof," she said quietly, more to herself than to me. "She can't do anything without it." "Still," I said, glancing nervously at the door. "She suspects us. And she's not going to stop looking." Clara nodded, her jaw tightening. "Then we'll just have to make sure she never finds anything." But even as she said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that Professor Ashtorn's words were more than just a warning, they were a promise. The dining hall was abuzz with chatter when Clara and I arrived, the usual morning hum of conversation amplified by the day's shocking development. Girls and boys alike huddled at their tables, their voices excited and incredulous as they gossiped about Emma. Clara and I exchanged a glance before heading to our usual spot near the corner of the hall, trying to blend in. I had changed into a soft lilac dress and flats, the routine of dressing up as Jessica now feeling strangely automatic. But despite the familiar rhythm of the morning, the sight that greeted us at the front of the hall was anything but ordinary. There, near the teacher's table, sat Emma, or rather, the infant version of her. She was perched in a high chair, her chubby hand smacking lightly against the tray as one of the professors attempted to feed her spoonfuls of oatmeal. The sight was surreal. Emma's bright pink onesie, no doubt conjured for her by one of the staff, stood out starkly against the more muted tones of the room. Her tiny face was scrunched up in irritation, her lips pursed as she resisted the spoon hovering near her mouth. "I'm not surprised she's being fussy," Clara whispered, her voice tinged with amusement as we sat down. "Even as a baby, she's got attitude." The sight drew stifled laughs and whispers from every corner of the room. "Did you hear what happened?" one girl at a nearby table asked, leaning in close to her friends. "They say she got caught with a forbidden spellbook. And that she cast it on herself." Another added, her eyes wide. "That doesn't sound like Emma," a boy said skeptically. "She's too careful for that. Someone must have set her up." Clara nudged me under the table, a small smirk playing at her lips. "Looks like the plan worked better than we thought," she murmured. I forced a small smile, though my nerves were still frayed from the confrontation with Professor Ashtorn. "It's a little weird seeing her like this," I admitted, glancing toward the high chair again. Emma's latest protest had earned her a sharp look from the teacher feeding her, who firmly insisted she take another bite. The infant's pout was unmistakable, her tiny fist clenching as if she were still the same domineering girl we all knew, just in a much smaller body. "You think she remembers any of this?" I asked softly. Clara shrugged. "Hard to say. If the spell worked the way the book said, she's got a baby's mind right now. But who knows? Maybe she'll remember bits and pieces when she's back to normal." I wasn't sure if that thought made me feel better or worse. As breakfast continued, the buzz about Emma's transformation refused to die down. Even the teachers seemed unsure of how to handle the situation, their glances toward the high chair filled with a mix of bewilderment and exasperation. "I give it until lunch," Clara whispered, taking a bite of toast. "Someone's bound to crack and ask what really happened." "Let's just hope it's not us," I muttered, my stomach twisting as I pushed my food around on my plate. Clara's smirk softened into something more reassuring. "Relax, Jessica. We're in the clear. For now." I nodded, though I couldn't shake the feeling that the events of the morning were only the beginning. As we ate, the chatter about Emma's transformation grew louder, weaving through the dining hall like wildfire. I kept my head down, trying to look disinterested as Clara casually nibbled on her toast, her confidence unshaken. "Do you think they're going to fix her today?" a girl at a nearby table asked, her voice low but excited. "Probably," her friend replied. "But can you imagine being stuck like that for hours? How embarrassing!" "It's Emma," a boy chimed in. She probably deserves it for something. Despite my best efforts to stay focused on my plate, my eyes kept drifting back to the high chair at the teacher's table. The professor feeding Emma, a stern-looking witch named Madame Hawthorne, was growing visibly frustrated as Emma continued to resist the oatmeal. "Stop fussing," Madame Hawthorne scolded, her tone clipped. "You'll eat this, or you'll go hungry." Emma responded with a loud wail, her chubby fists slamming against the tray in defiance. A few students burst into laughter, quickly stifled by disapproving glares from nearby teachers. Clara leaned toward me, her voice barely a whisper. "She's really not taking this well, is she? Would you?" I muttered back, though I couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction watching Emma's tantrum. Madame Hawthorne sighed, clearly at her wit's end, and conjured a small enchanted toy, a floating, sparkling butterfly, to try and distract Emma long enough to sneak a spoonful of oatmeal into her mouth. "That'll keep her busy for all of 5 seconds, Clara whispered with a smirk. I bit back a laugh, glancing nervously at the teachers. Professor Ashtorn was seated farther down the table, her piercing gaze occasionally sweeping the room. Every time her eyes passed over us, my stomach twisted into knots. "Do you think she still suspects us?" I asked Clara under my breath. "She doesn't have proof," Clara replied confidently. "That's all that matters." Across the hall, another burst of laughter drew our attention. A group of older students was whispering animatedly, their eyes fixed on Emma as she swatted at the butterfly with her tiny hands. "I heard she was experimenting with a regression spell," one boy said, his voice carrying just enough for us to hear. "On herself?" his friend asked, incredulous. "Apparently," the boy replied with a shrug. "She probably thought she could handle it. Classic Emma." Clara nudged me, her grin widening. "Looks like the story's sticking." I nodded, though my chest felt tight. The plan had worked, yes, but the weight of Professor Ashtorn's suspicion still loomed over me like a storm cloud. As the meal continued, the teachers grew increasingly weary of Emma's antics. Madame Hawthorne finally handed her off to another professor, who conjured a small bassinet and tucked her inside. Emma's wails quieted into soft whimpers as the bassinet rocked gently, the enchanted motion soothing her to sleep. The sight was almost surreal, a girl who had spent years terrorizing others now reduced to a helpless infant, cradled in the care of the very teacher she once tried to manipulate. "Enjoy it while it lasts," Clara said quietly as we finished our breakfast. "By the time she's back to normal, this whole school will have heard about it." "Do you think she'll figure out it was us?" I asked, my voice tinged with worry. Clara hesitated, her confident smirk faltering just slightly. "Maybe. But even if she does, she won't have proof. We've covered our tracks too well." I wasn't so sure, but there was no turning back now. As the bell signaled the end of breakfast, Clara and I rose from the table, our eyes meeting briefly in silent agreement. Whatever came next, we'd face it together. The dining hall had just begun to clear when Professor Ashtorn's sharp voice cut through the lingering hum of conversation. "Jessica, come with me." I froze mid-step, my heart lurching in my chest. Clara shot me a worried glance, but before either of us could say anything, Professor Ashtorn was already walking toward the exit, her robes trailing behind her like dark shadows. "Go," Clara mouthed, her eyes wide. Reluctantly, I followed the professor out of the dining hall, my pulse quickening with every step. She led me through the quiet, echoing corridors of the school, her stride purposeful and unyielding. My mind raced, replaying everything that had happened the night before and that morning. She knows. She has to know. When we reached her office, Professor Ashtorn opened the heavy wooden door with a flick of her wand and gestured for me to step inside. The room was dimly lit, the walls lined with shelves of ancient tomes and jars filled with strange, glowing substances. "Sit," she commanded, pointing to the chair in front of her desk. I sat, my hands clenched tightly in my lap as she closed the door behind her. The heavy thud of the latch made the room feel even smaller. Professor Ashtorn moved to her desk, her piercing eyes fixed on me as she took her seat. For a moment, she said nothing, her fingers steepled under her chin. The silence was unbearable. "Jessica," she said finally, her voice calm but firm. "I've been thinking about this morning's incident." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Yes, Professor?" She leaned forward slightly, her gaze sharp enough to cut through stone. "You were seen in the restricted section yesterday. Caught with a forbidden book, no less. And now, Emma, one of your known adversaries, has been turned into a baby. Her wand marked with the spell. Tell me, what am I supposed to make of this?" "I don't know, Professor," I said quickly, my voice trembling slightly. "But it wasn't me." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Is that so?" I nodded, trying to meet her gaze without flinching. Professor Ashtorn leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Interesting," she said softly. "Because I also happen to know what Emma did to you yesterday." My heart skipped a beat. "Yes," she continued, her voice almost conversational now. "Emma turned your mind into that of a girl. Quite the cruel trick, wouldn't you agree? And yet, Clara, clever as she is, found a way to reverse it. I suspect you owe her your gratitude for that." I stayed silent, my stomach twisting into knots. "Now," she said, leaning forward again, her voice taking on a harder edge. "Tell me, Jessica, did you and Claire retaliate by turning Emma into a baby?" "No," I said firmly, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. Professor Ashtorn studied me for a long moment, her dark eyes searching for any hint of deception. Then, with a flick of her wand, a strange sensation washed over me. I looked down and realized I was changing again, my body reshaping, my features hardening. Within seconds, I was no longer Jessica but Nolan again, my true self restored. The sight was jarring, and for a moment, I simply stared at my hands, my breath caught in my throat. Professor Ashtorn's voice broke the silence. "There! You're free of your punishment, for now. But if you confess to what you've done, this matter can be resolved cleanly and without further consequences." "I didn't do it," I said again, my voice firmer this time. She narrowed her eyes, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You expect me to believe that Emma's current state is pure coincidence? That the two of you, caught sneaking into the restricted section just yesterday, had nothing to do with it?" "Yes," I said, my gaze unwavering. "Because it's the truth." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick enough to choke on. Finally, Professor Ashtorn stood, her expression cold and unreadable. "Very well, Nolan. If you insist on maintaining your innocence, so be it. But let me be clear, this investigation is far from over." She waved her wand again, and the strange, familiar sensation returned. Within seconds, I was back to being Jessica, the lilac dress once again fitting perfectly over my now slender frame. "This punishment remains in place," she said sharply. "You may go. But know this, Jessica, truth has a way of surfacing, whether you like it or not." I stood slowly, but as I turned to leave, her voice stopped me in my tracks. "Your wand," she said, holding out her hand. I froze, my heart sinking. "What?" "Your wand," she repeated, her tone firm and unyielding. "Until this matter is resolved, I'll be keeping it. If you are truly innocent, you have nothing to worry about." Reluctantly, I reached into my pocket and handed her the wand, the familiar weight leaving my hand like a piece of myself being taken away. "Dismissed," she said coldly, tucking the wand into her desk drawer. I left the office feeling smaller than ever, the weight of her suspicions pressing down on me with every step. Without my wand, I felt exposed, and more uncertain than ever about what would come next. The dormitory was quiet when I returned, the lingering buzz from breakfast gone now that everyone had dispersed to their morning routines. The soft light filtering through the windows made the space feel oddly serene, a sharp contrast to the storm of emotions churning inside me. I walked to my bunk slowly, my steps feeling heavier with each one. The weight of Professor Ashtorn's words and the absence of my wand left me feeling raw, exposed, and helpless. When I reached my bed, I sat down, smoothing the lilac dress over my knees out of habit. My eyes darted around the room, searching for Clara, or Daniel, but there was no sign of her. "She's probably just off somewhere," I muttered to myself, though the hollow ache in my chest didn't ease. I leaned back against the wall, staring up at the ceiling. The events of the morning played over and over in my mind, every word and glance from Professor Ashtorn etched into my memory. The thought of being without my wand was suffocating. It wasn't just a tool, it was a part of me, a piece of my identity as a wizard. Without it, I felt disconnected, incomplete. "Where are you, Clara?" I whispered, the empty dormitory offering no answers. My thoughts drifted to her as I sat there, alone. She had always been so composed, so confident, even in the face of danger. But this morning, when Professor Ashtorn had taken us aside, I'd sensed something different, a crack in her armor, however small. What if she had been caught? What if she had decided to take the blame for everything to protect me? The idea made my stomach twist, guilt pooling in my chest. Clara had risked so much to help me, and I hadn't even been able to find the words to thank her properly. I glanced toward her bunk, half expecting her to walk through the door with that familiar smirk on her face, ready to brush off the morning's drama like it was nothing. But the room remained still, her absence a quiet reminder of just how alone I felt. All I could do now was wait, and hope she was okay. I was still sitting on my bunk, lost in thought, when the dormitory door creaked open. My head snapped up to see Professor Ashtorn sweeping inside, her expression as stern and unreadable as ever. But it wasn't her presence that made my breath catch in my throat, it was the small figure she carried in her arms. A toddler! The child looked to be about 3 years old, with wide, familiar eyes and a mop of short brown hair that was unmistakably Clara's. My heart sank as Professor Ashtorn gently set the child on the floor in front of me. The toddler, Clara, looked up at me with a mixture of confusion and frustration, her chubby cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She wore a too large school shirt that hung down like a dress, her small feet bare against the stone floor. "Jessica," Professor Ashtorn said sharply, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. "This is Clara. This is her punishment for refusing to tell the truth." My mouth went dry as I stared at Clara. "No, Daniel?" In her new, tiny form. She crossed her arms, a small pout forming on her lips, and muttered something unintelligible under her breath. Professor Ashtorn's piercing gaze locked onto me. "And if you don't tell me the full truth, Jessica, you'll join her." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "Professor, She cut me off with a raised hand. "No more excuses! Either you tell me exactly what happened, or you both spend the rest of the day as toddlers. The choice is yours." Before I could respond, the door opened again, and Mrs. Yomi entered, carrying baby Emma in her arms. The tiny infant was still dressed in her pink onesie, her round face scrunched up in confusion as she glanced around the room. "I brought you some help," Professor Ashtorn said, addressing Mrs. Yomi. "You'll be babysitting these 3 until further notice." "Understood," Mrs. Yomi said, her tone calm but firm. She glanced at Clara and then at me, her expression unreadable. Professor Ashtorn turned back to me, her wand already in hand. "Well, Jessica? What will it be?" I hesitated, my stomach twisting into knots. "I didn't." Before I could finish, she flicked her wand, and a strange, tingling sensation spread over me. My body began to shrink, my limbs growing shorter and pudgier, my dress billowing out awkwardly before it adjusted itself to fit my new size. Within moments, I was no longer Jessica the 10-year-old girl, but a small, 3-year-old version of myself. My legs dangled off the edge of the bunk as I stared up at Professor Ashtorn, now towering over me. "Good," she said, her tone sharp. "Now you can both think about your actions." I opened my mouth to protest, but the words that came out were stilted and broken. "No fair! No do anything!" Beside me, toddler Clara stomped her tiny foot, her voice high-pitched and laced with frustration. "No tell you nothing! Mean!" Professor Ashtorn's expression didn't waver. "Mrs. Yomi, they're all yours. Keep them contained, and make sure they don't get into any more trouble." Mrs. Yomi nodded, setting baby Emma on a soft blanket on the floor. "Understood, Professor." With that, Professor Ashtorn swept out of the room, leaving the 3 of us under Mrs. Yomi's watchful eye. I glanced at Clara, her small, furious face now looking even more ridiculous in her shrunken state, and then at baby Emma, who gurgled happily on her blanket. "This dumb," Clara muttered, her tiny arms crossed over her chest. "No wanna be like this," I agreed, my words clumsy and childish. Mrs. Yomi sighed, her stern expression softening slightly. "You two better behave," she said, setting down a tray of colorful toys. "Because you're going to be like this for a while." As Clara and I exchanged defeated glances, I couldn't help but think that Professor Ashtorn had made her point loud and clear. Mrs. Yomi wasted no time asserting her authority over our ridiculous predicament. After settling baby Emma back into her bassinet with a soft blanket and some toys, she turned her sharp gaze toward Clara and me. "You two," she said firmly, pointing at us. "Come here." Clara hesitated, her small face scrunching up in defiance. "No wanna," she huffed, crossing her tiny arms. Mrs. Yomi raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "You're already in enough trouble, young lady, don't make it worse." I shot Clara a look, silently pleading with her not to push things further. Reluctantly, she shuffled forward, her small bare feet pattering softly against the floor. I followed, feeling the same mix of embarrassment and frustration twisting in my chest. Mrs. Yomi motioned for us to sit on a nearby bench, which now felt far too large for our shrunken frames. "If you're going to spend the day as toddlers, you'll need to look the part," she said matter-of-factly. She opened a bag that seemed to appear out of nowhere, pulling out two small, frilly pink dresses. The fabric shimmered faintly in the light, adorned with tiny bows and lace trim. Clara's eyes widened in horror. "No way!" she squeaked, her broken toddler speech not masking her outrage. "No pink! No lace! You don't have a choice," Mrs. Yomi said calmly, holding up one of the dresses. "Now, arms up!" I hesitated, glancing at Clara, who glared at me with a mix of frustration and betrayal. "We know babies," I muttered, though my voice lacked conviction. Mrs. Yomi's expression didn't soften. "Up! Now!" Reluctantly, I raised my arms, my cheeks burning with humiliation as Mrs. Yomi slipped the dress over my head. The fabric was soft and smooth, but the ruffles and bows made me feel utterly ridiculous. Once the dress was on, she adjusted the fit and gave a satisfied nod. "There," she said, turning to Clara. "Your turn." Clara tried to wriggle away, but Mrs. Yomi was faster. Within moments, she had Clara dressed as well, the second pink dress fitting her tiny form perfectly. Clara's pout deepened as she glanced down at the frills and lace, her fists clenched in frustration. "This dumb," she muttered, her words garbled but clear enough to convey her discontent. "Oh, I'm not done yet," Mrs. Yomi said, reaching into the bag again. Clara and I exchanged panicked looks as she pulled out two pull-ups adorned with colorful, childish patterns. "No!" Clara squeaked, scrambling backward on the bench. "No need dos!" Mrs. Yomi sighed, her patience clearly wearing thin. "You're toddlers now, whether you like it or not. And toddlers wear pull-ups. Now, hold still!" Despite our protests, Mrs. Yomi quickly outfitted us in the pull-ups, the thick material feeling foreign and embarrassing. Clara scowled the entire time, muttering under her breath, while I sat silently, too mortified to speak. "There," Mrs. Yomi said finally, stepping back to admire her work. "Much better! Now, you two behave yourselves while I take care of Emma." As she walked away, Clara turned to me, her face red with embarrassment. "This worst," she muttered, her broken speech laced with frustration. I couldn't help but agree. "We gotta get out of this," I said softly, tugging at the hem of the frilly dress. But as I glanced toward Mrs. Yomi, now cooing softly at baby Emma, I realized just how impossible that task seemed. Clara and I sat side by side in the middle of the magically conjured playpen, the shimmering bars surrounding us glowing faintly. Every time one of us so much as touched them, the barrier emitted a soft hum that made it clear escape was impossible. The frilly pink dresses and pull-ups only added to the indignity of the situation. Clara fumed quietly beside me, her tiny arms crossed and her cheeks flushed with frustration. I wasn't doing much better, shifting uncomfortably as I tried to ignore the faint rustle of the pull-up whenever I moved. Across the room, Professor Ashtorn swept in with her usual air of authority. She carried a small vial filled with a shimmering, silver liquid that glowed faintly in the dim light. In her other hand, she held a baby bottle, its contents freshly enchanted to hold the potion. Mrs. Yomi, still sitting near Emma's bassinet, looked up as Professor Ashtorn approached. "It's ready," Professor Ashtorn said briskly, tilting the potion bottle slightly to watch the liquid swirl inside. "This will return her to her proper age and form." I watched with a mixture of dread and fascination as Professor Ashtorn poured the potion into the baby bottle, her movements precise and deliberate. The silver liquid glimmered as it filled the bottle, and with a soft flick of her wand, the bottle sealed itself and began to gently warm. "Here we go," Professor Ashtorn said, stepping toward the bassinet. She held the bottle out to Emma, who was squirming and whimpering softly. "Drink up, little one! You won't be little for much longer!" The baby gurgled, clearly confused, but didn't resist as Professor Ashtorn gently guided the bottle to her lips. Emma latched on instinctively, the soft sound of her drinking filling the room. Clara and I exchanged a wide-eyed glance. Even in our current state, it was hard not to feel a pang of nervous anticipation as we watched the potion work its magic. Emma's transformation began almost immediately, the soft glow of the potion spread through her tiny body, and within moments, she started to grow. Her limbs stretched, her chubby cheeks thinned, and her infant onesie shimmered and morphed into her usual school uniform. In less than a minute, Emma was back to her 10-year-old self, sitting up in the bassinet with a dazed expression. "What just?" she muttered, her voice groggy and confused. "Welcome back, Emma," Professor Ashtorn said coolly. Emma blinked, clearly disoriented, but the color drained from her face when she spotted Clara and me sitting in the playpen. Her wide eyes darted between us and Professor Ashtorn. What are they doing like that?" Emma asked, her voice rising in alarm. Professor Ashtorn ignored her question, turning instead toward us. She set the empty potion bottle down on a nearby table and crossed her arms. "There's plenty of potion left," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Enough for the two of you to return to your proper forms as well. But that's only if you're willing to tell me the truth." Clara's small fist clenched at her sides. "No tell!" she snapped, her speech still broken and garbled. "No do nothing!" I glanced at her nervously, then back at Professor Ashtorn. The gleam in her eyes made it clear she wasn't bluffing. "You can remain like this all day if you choose," she said, her tone icy. "But the truth has a way of surfacing, whether you admit it or not. The potion is here for you, if you're ready to talk." Clara huffed, crossing her arms and turning away. "No fair," she muttered under her breath. I sat frozen, my mind racing. The promise of the potion was tempting, but the risk of confessing was far too great. Clara and I had come too far to let everything unravel now. Professor Ashtorn raised an eyebrow, waiting. The playpen hummed softly around us, a constant reminder of our predicament, as Clara and I stared back at her in defiant silence. Professor Ashtorn's sharp voice broke through Clara's muttered complaints. "Jessica, come with me!" Before I could respond, the bars of the playpen shimmered and shifted, opening just wide enough for her to lift me out. Her hands were firm but not unkind as she set me on the floor. "Walk," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. I stumbled slightly, the unfamiliar toddler proportions of my legs making every step awkward. I glanced back at Clara, who was glaring daggers at me, her tiny fists clenched tightly. Professor Ashtorn led me through a side door into a small, sparsely furnished room. A single chair and a low table stood in the center, illuminated by the faint glow of enchanted lanterns. She gestured for me to sit in the chair, which was adjusted to fit my current size, and took her place across from me. For a moment, she said nothing, her piercing gaze steadying me as I squirmed uncomfortably in my frilly dress. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "What happened if I confess?" I asked, the broken toddler speech making my words clumsy and slow. Professor Ashtorn raised an eyebrow. "A fair question," she said softly. With a flick of her wand, a faint glow passed over me, and I felt my voice change. "Try speaking now," she commanded. I hesitated, then said, "What happens if I confess?" The words came out clear and normal, though the high-pitched sound of my toddler voice was still unsettling. "Much better," she said. "Now we can have a proper conversation." She leaned forward slightly, folding her hands on the table. "If you confess, you'll tell me exactly how you and Clara pulled off this little stunt. You'll explain everything, from start to finish." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "And then?" Professor Ashtorn's expression remained unreadable. "You'll receive a longer punishment. As a 10-year-old girl, you'll remain under the same terms of your current punishment for another 2 weeks, rather than returning to your original self at the end of this weekend. But you'll be treated fairly, your wand will be returned, and you'll continue your classes." The weight of her words pressed down on me. "And if I don't confess?" Her dark eyes narrowed. "Then you will remain in your current state, a toddler, until the end of the school year." I flinched, my breath catching in my throat. "The whole year?" "Yes," she said simply. "You'll be placed in a nursery under constant supervision, unable to attend classes or participate in your usual activities. Your academic progress will be put on hold until you're restored to your proper self. By the time the punishment is lifted, you'll be a full year behind your peers." Her tone softened slightly, though her expression remained firm. "This isn't a decision to be made lightly, Jessica. I understand the temptation to protect yourself and Clara, but consider the consequences carefully." I stared down at the table, my mind racing. The idea of spending the rest of the school year as a toddler was unbearable, but the thought of extending my punishment as a 10-year-old girl for another 2 weeks wasn't much better. Professor Ashtorn leaned back in her chair, her gaze unwavering. "You have until the end of this discussion to decide. The truth, or silence. The choice is yours." My hands trembled in my lap as I tried to steady my thoughts. No matter which option I chose, the road ahead was fraught with difficulty, and there was no turning back. I stared down at my tiny hands, the frilly pink fabric of my dress brushing against my knees. Professor Ashtorn's words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. "Confess and remain a 10-year-old girl for longer. Stay silent and spend the rest of the school year trapped as a toddler." But one question still lingered in my mind. What about Clara?" I asked softly, my high-pitched voice trembling. Professor Ashtorn tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes narrowing. "What about her?" I hesitated, trying to find the right words. "If I confess, what happens to her? She's in trouble too, isn't she?" For a moment, the professor didn't respond. She studied me carefully, her sharp gaze searching my face for something. Finally, she sighed and leaned back in her chair. "If you confess, Clara's punishment will remain in place for a few more days. She'll stay as a toddler until the middle of the week," she said evenly. "But after that, she'll be restored to her current form as a 10-year-old girl and allowed to resume her classes as normal." I frowned, confusion swirling in my chest. "So, she'd get to go back to normal sooner?" "Sooner, yes," Professor Ashtorn replied, her tone measured. "But only if you tell me the truth." The words struck me like a weight, their implications sinking in. Clara had risked everything to protect me, even now maintaining the facade of innocence to shield us both. And if I confessed, I'd be taking on a heavier burden, but I'd also be sparing her the worst of the punishment. But at what cost? Professor Ashtorn leaned forward again, her voice soft but firm. "You have to decide, Jessica. Protect yourself, or protect her. You cannot do both." I clenched my fists, my thoughts racing. Clara had been the one to mastermind the plan, to carry it out flawlessly. She had taken risks I never would have dared, all for the sake of making things right. And now, I was the one faced with a decision that could change everything. Professor Ashtorn's gaze never wavered as she waited for my answer, the tension in the room pressing down on me like a storm. The weight of the choice sat heavily in my chest, the stakes pressing down on me as I glanced up at Professor Ashtorn. Her piercing eyes studied me intently, waiting for my answer. I took a shaky breath. "I'll confess," I said softly, the high-pitched tone of my voice making the words feel more vulnerable than I intended. But, only if you promise not to tell Clara I did. Professor Ashtorn raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. And why, exactly, would you make such a condition? I hesitated, trying to put my reasoning into words. Because, I owe her that. She's done a lot for me. If she found out I confessed, it'd hurt her. I don't want that. The professor regarded me for a long moment, her gaze sharp and calculating. Finally, she gave a small nod. Very well, she said. If you confess, I won't reveal to Clara that you were the one who spoke. But that also means you'll remain as a toddler for the rest of the day, as your punishment for withholding the truth for so long. Do you accept those terms? I swallowed hard, my tiny hands clenching the edge of the chair. I accept. Professor Ashtorn leaned back slightly. Then tell me everything. From the beginning. And so, I did. I recounted everything, from sneaking into the restricted section to finding the book and swapping Emma's wand with a duplicate. I told her how Clara had cast the spell and how we carefully covered our tracks to make it look like Emma had done it herself. Professor Ashtorn listened silently, her expression never wavering as she took in every detail. When I finished, the room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the faint hum of the enchanted lanterns. You're fortunate, she said finally, her voice calm but firm. If this had gone unnoticed any longer, the consequences could have been far more severe. You and Clara are both reckless, but I will honor our agreement. Clara will not know you confessed. Relief and dread mixed uneasily in my chest. Thank you, I said softly. Without a word, Professor Ashtorn flicked her wand again, and I felt the familiar tingling sensation wash over me. My voice shifted back to the broken, babyish tone from earlier, and my heart sank at the realization. I pouted, crossing my arms as I said, Yukuha we sweat me keep to voice. A faint, almost amused glint appeared in Professor Ashtorn's eyes. Consider it part of your punishment. I slumped back in the chair, muttering incoherent complaints under my breath. Professor Ashtorn stood, her robes billowing slightly as she gestured toward the door. Back to the playpen for now, Jessica. And remember, you've made your choice. Now you'll have to live with it. I nodded reluctantly, sliding off the chair and toddling toward the door. The rest of the day loomed ahead of me, but at least Clara wouldn't have to bear the full weight of what we'd done. That thought, small as it was, kept me going. Lunch was a different kind of ordeal. When Mrs. Yomi came to fetch us from the playpen, the magical bar shimmered and disappeared, leaving Clara and me standing awkwardly in our frilly pink dresses and pull-ups. Time for lunch, Mrs. Yomi said briskly, motioning for us to follow. Clara crossed her tiny arms, her pout practically permanent by now. No wanna go, she huffed in her broken toddler speech. Me neither, I muttered, tugging at the hem of my dress. You don't have a choice, Mrs. Yomi said firmly. She reached down, taking both of our hands, and began leading us toward the dining hall. Every step made me more self-conscious. The soft rustle of the pull-up beneath my dress was impossible to ignore, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone we passed could hear it. Clara walked beside me, her tiny face a mask of stubborn defiance, but I could tell she was just as embarrassed as I was. When we arrived at the dining hall, the usual hum of conversation immediately faltered. Heads turned, and a hush fell over the room as students caught sight of the two toddlers being escorted inside by Mrs. Yomi. The whispering started almost immediately. Is that Jessica? And Clara? What happened to them? They look so ridiculous. My cheeks burned as we were led toward a small table near the front of the hall, right in full view of everyone. It was a humiliating spot, clearly chosen for maximum visibility. As we walked, my eyes darted around the room, trying to avoid the stares and snickers of my classmates. That's when I spotted her. Emma. She was sitting alone at a table near the edge of the hall, her usual entourage nowhere to be seen. She was wearing a tank top and shorts, but something about her was off. Her posture was stiff, her hands fidgeting in her lap, and her face was pale. And then I saw it, her thumb. Emma's thumb hovered near her mouth, her lips twitching as if she were fighting the urge to suck on it. Her eyes darted around the room nervously, and when she caught sight of me and Clara, her expression hardened. Clara noticed her too, and I saw the faintest flicker of a smirk cross her face. "She no wanna suck thumb," Clara whispered to me, her toddler voice laced with amusement. "She act like big girl, but not foolin' no one." "Shh!" I muttered, tugging at Clara's hand. "No make worse." Mrs. Yomi guided us to our seats at the toddler table, which had been set up with colorful plates and plastic cups. The humiliation deepened as we climbed into chairs that were far too small for even our toddler forms, the room still buzzing with whispers and laughter. I glanced over at Emma again. She caught my eye, her cheeks flushing as she quickly lowered her hand to her lap. Despite everything, she still carried herself with a shred of pride, but it was clear the ordeal had rattled her. Lunch was served soon after, the trolls lumbering between tables with trays of food. Clara and I were given small portions of mashed potatoes, soft vegetables, and cut-up pieces of chicken, clearly toddler-appropriate fare. Clara scowled at her plate. "Dumb," she muttered, stabbing at the food with a plastic fork. "Come on, you eat," I said, though my own appetite was non-existent. As the lunch period dragged on, the stares and whispers from the other students didn't let up. Clara and I were the center of attention, but for the first time, I wasn't the only one feeling exposed. Emma sat rigidly at her table, her fingers twitching as she resisted the urge to revert to babyish habits. It was a small victory, but it didn't make the day any easier. After lunch, Mrs. Yomi escorted Clara and me down a quiet hallway. My small legs struggled to keep up, and the soft rustling of my pull-up with every step reminded me how far I had fallen. Clara walked beside me, her tiny face still set in a stubborn pout. Our destination wasn't one of the usual classrooms or dormitories. Instead, we were led to a small, cozy room tucked away near the back of the school. It was furnished hastily, with bright-colored rugs, small chairs, and shelves lined with simple toys and picture books. A female wood elf stood near the center of the room, her presence calm and ethereal. Her long, golden hair shimmered in the light, and her green eyes sparkled with a mix of amusement and curiosity as she looked at us. She was dressed in flowing robes of earthy tones, her delicate hands folded in front of her. "This is Elira," Mrs. Yomi said. "She'll be looking after you this afternoon. Don't give her any trouble." Clara huffed softly but said nothing. Elira's voice was warm and lilting, with a musical quality that instantly set me at ease. "Welcome, little ones," she said with a faint smile. "You'll be spending the afternoon here with me. I trust we'll get along well." Mrs. Yomi gave a curt nod before leaving the room, the door closing softly behind her. Clara immediately crossed her arms, her toddler speech stumbling out in frustration. "No need babysitter. We big kids." Elira tilted her head slightly, her smile unwavering. "I'm sure you feel that way, dear. But for now, this is where you'll stay." Clara grumbled under her breath and toddled toward a small table with a few scattered toys. I followed hesitantly, unsure of what else to do. After a few minutes, Clara turned to Elira, her tone impatient. "Can work on magic homework? Got lots to do." Elira raised an eyebrow, a faint twinkle of amusement in her eyes. "Magic homework, I suppose there's no harm in trying." She conjured a small slate and a piece of enchanted chalk, setting them on the table in front of Clara. The chalk glowed faintly, ready to obey Clara's magical commands. Clara eagerly grabbed the chalk and began to write, but as soon as she looked at the symbols she'd drawn, her face crunched up in confusion. "Dad, no look white," she muttered, staring at the slate. I leaned over to see, but the symbols didn't make any sense to me either. They twisted and shifted, looking more like squiggly lines than actual letters or words. Clara frowned and tried again, drawing a simple spell rune. But when she looked back at it, the rune dissolved into a jumbled mess of meaningless shapes. "What wrong?" Clara whined, her frustration growing. "No can read." Elira stepped forward, her voice gentle. "That's because toddlers can't read or write properly, my dear. It's part of the developmental magic affecting you. Your minds aren't equipped to process written language right now." Clara's eyes widened in disbelief. "No file!" she squeaked, her tiny fist pounding the table. "How supposed to do anything?" I slumped in my chair, my own sense of helplessness deepening. "We stuck like this?" "For now," Elira said, her voice calm but firm. "But there are plenty of other things you can do. You don't need written words to learn and grow." Clara scowled, crossing her arms. "This dumb!" I nodded in agreement, though I didn't have the energy to say it out loud. The rest of the day stretched ahead of us, and for the first time, I truly felt the weight of being a toddler in both body and mind. Elira's calming presence filled the nursery as Clara and I sat at the small table, fuming quietly. The room was cozy, with soft rugs, colorful decorations, and shelves lined with toys, but the humiliation of being treated like toddlers still weighed heavily on me. Elira crouched down to our level, her warm smile never fading. "Why don't we try something fun?" she suggested, her lilting voice gentle and encouraging. "Wha fun?" Clara muttered, her arms still crossed. "No can do anything like this." I nodded in agreement, my frustration mirrored on my face. "This dumb," I added. Elira chuckled softly, her golden hair shimmering as she tilted her head. "There's plenty you can do, even like this. Would you like to build something?" She waved her hand gracefully, and a pile of enchanted wooden blocks appeared on the rug. They glowed faintly, shifting colors as they settled into a neat pile. "Blocks?" Clara asked, wrinkling her nose. "These are special blocks," Elira said with a wink. "They can move and build themselves, but only if you tell them what you want." Clara's curiosity piqued despite herself. She slid off the chair and toddled over to the blocks, her small hands hesitating before picking one up. "Move?" she demanded, her voice still laced with skepticism. The block wiggled slightly in her hand, glowing brighter. Clara's eyes widened in surprise. "See?" Elira said encouragingly. "What do you want to build?" Clara looked thoughtful for a moment before saying, "Tor." The blocks began to move, arranging themselves into a small but impressive tower. Clara's pout dissolved into a delighted giggle as she watched them stack higher. "They move! They really move!" I couldn't help but smile, sliding off my chair to join her. "Me turn!" I said eagerly, reaching for a block. Together, we built towers, bridges, and even a wobbly castle that toppled over when Clara accidentally sneezed. Each time the blocks obeyed, shifting and glowing as we directed them, the frustration of the morning faded a little more. Elira guided us gently, offering suggestions and cheering for our creations. Her patience and warmth made the nursery feel less like a punishment and more like a sanctuary, even if just for a while. Eventually, the energy of the room began to slow. Clara yawned first, rubbing her eyes with her small fists. "Tired," she mumbled, her voice soft and slurred. "Me too," I admitted, my body feeling heavier as exhaustion crept in. Elira smiled knowingly. With a wave of her hand, two small, plush cots appeared in the corner of the room, complete with soft blankets and pillows. "It's time for a little rest," she said gently. Clara didn't argue, toddling over to one of the cots and climbing in clumsily. I followed, the soft blanket feeling like a cloud as I pulled it over myself. Elira hummed softly, a melodic tune that seemed to wrap around us like a warm embrace. The glow of the enchanted lanterns dimmed, and the room grew quiet as sleep pulled us both under. For the first time since the punishment began, I felt a sense of peace, however fleeting. I woke to the gentle sound of Elira's voice humming a soft tune. Blinking groggily, I pushed the warm blanket off and sat up in the cot, stretching my tiny arms. Across from me, Clara was doing the same, her hair sticking up in wild tufts. "Ugh!" Clara groaned, rubbing her eyes with her small fists. "Why wake up? So comfy!" "Me too," I mumbled, still half asleep. Elira's melodic voice drifted over to us. "It's time for a little snack, dears," she said warmly, her golden eyes sparkling. "Snack?" Clara perked up slightly, her grogginess fading. "Snack," I echoed, my stomach rumbling at the thought. Elira waved her hand, and the small table we played at earlier now held a tray of colorful, toddler-sized snacks. There were sliced fruits, small crackers, and tiny cups of juice that shimmered faintly with enchantment. The sight was both inviting and a little embarrassing, it looked like something straight out of a nursery. Clara toddled over first, her curiosity outweighing her lingering frustration. "What dis?" she asked, pointing at a bright green fruit slice. "Enchanted kiwi," Illyra said with a smile. "It's sweet and juicy, perfect for little ones like you." Clara hesitated, then popped the slice into her mouth. Her eyes widened as a sweet, tangy flavor hit her tongue. "Yummy!" she declared, grabbing another. I followed, picking up a piece of apple that sparkled faintly with golden light. It was crisp and sweet, the enchantment giving it a faint warmth that made it even better than regular fruit. Illyra watched us eat, her serene smile never fading. "I thought you might like these," she said. "They're magical enough to be fun, but simple enough to suit your current forms." "Day good," Clara admitted, though her toddler speech still carried a note of reluctance. I nodded in agreement, sipping carefully from my juice cup. The juice was cool and refreshing, with a hint of magic that made it sparkle on my tongue. For a moment, I forgot about the humiliation of the day and just enjoyed the taste. As we finished our snacks, Clara leaned back in her chair with a satisfied sigh. "Wish could eat like this all time," she muttered, then quickly added, "but no like being this size." Illyra chuckled softly, clearing the table with a wave of her hand. "You'll both return to your proper selves soon enough," she said gently. "For now, just enjoy the moment." Clara pouted but didn't argue, and I couldn't help but agree. For all its indignities, this moment of peace was a small comfort in the chaos of the day. With snack time over, Illyra clapped her hands softly, her golden hair shimmering in the dim light of the nursery. "Now that your tummies are full, it's time for a bit more play before the day moves on," she said warmly. Clara and I exchanged a look, equal parts resignation and curiosity. The enchantments on the snacks had left us both feeling a bit more energized, and despite my reluctance, the idea of more playtime didn't seem entirely awful. "What wanna do now?" Illyra asked, her voice melodic as she gestured toward the shelves of toys and games. "Blocks again? Or perhaps something different?" Clara crossed her arms, still maintaining a hint of her stubborn streak. "Don't wanna play baby stuff," she muttered, though the allure of the colorful toys clearly tugged at her resolve. Illyra smiled knowingly. With a graceful wave of her hand, a new set of toys appeared on the rug, wooden animals that moved on their own, miniature figures of unicorns, dragons, and other magical creatures that pranced and fluttered as if alive. "Look at the unicorn!" I squeaked, unable to hide my excitement as a tiny, shimmering unicorn trotted across the rug, its mane sparkling like sunlight. Clara's eyes widened despite herself. "What do?" she asked, leaning closer. "Anything you want," Illyra said with a soft chuckle. "They respond to your imagination. Tell them what to do, and they'll obey." Clara reached out hesitantly, her tiny hand brushing against the unicorn. "Run!" she demanded. The unicorn immediately broke into a tiny gallop, its hooves clinking softly against the wooden floor. Clara's face lit up with delight, her earlier pout vanishing. "Fly!" I said, pointing at a miniature dragon. The dragon unfurled its tiny wings and took off, fluttering around my head with a cheerful chirp. I giggled, reaching up to touch it, but it darted playfully out of reach. Soon, the room was filled with laughter as Clara and I directed the enchanted toys. The unicorns raced each other across the rug, dragons swooped and soared, and tiny, glowing butterflies flitted around us, leaving trails of sparkling light in their wake. Clara's stubbornness melted away entirely as she coaxed a miniature phoenix to perch on her shoulder. "Look! It's Stay!" she said proudly, her speech still broken but full of joy. I was busy creating an obstacle course for a group of scampering foxes when Illyra joined us on the rug, sitting cross-legged and watching with a contented smile. "You're both quite imaginative," she said. "It's good to see you enjoying yourselves." Clara beamed, holding up the phoenix. "Can keep this one?" Illyra laughed gently. "I'm afraid not, little one. but you can enjoy it as long as you're here. HMMPH, Clara muttered, though her grin remained. As the play session continued, I found myself forgetting the embarrassment of the day. The toys, Elira's warmth, and Claire's rare moments of pure delight created a sense of comfort I hadn't expected. Even if it was temporary, this moment felt like a small reprieve from the chaos, and for now, I was okay with that. Clara and I were deep in play, directing a flock of enchanted birds to perform little acrobatics in the air, when the door to the nursery opened. The soft click of Professor Ashtorn's boots on the floor instantly silenced the room. Clara froze, her tiny phoenix dropping to the rug with a soft chirp, while I stiffened, clutching one of the glowing butterflies in my hand. Elira stood gracefully, offering the professor a polite nod. "Professor Ashtorn," Elira greeted, her melodic voice calm. "What brings you here?" "I've come to address the matter of their punishment," Professor Ashtorn replied, her gaze sharp as it landed on me and Clara. I swallowed hard, already feeling the weight of what was coming. Clara, however, frowned, crossing her small arms defiantly. "What you want now?" she huffed in her broken toddler speech. Professor Ashtorn arched an eyebrow at Clara's defiance before turning to Elira. "Thank you for looking after them," she said. "I'll take Jessica now. She and I have a few things to discuss." Elira nodded gracefully and stepped aside. "Of course, Professor." Professor Ashtorn turned her piercing gaze to Clara. "As for you, Clara, your punishment will continue as planned. You'll remain in this form for the next few days before being restored to your 10-year-old self. You'll resume your classes after that, and I expect no further incidents." Clara's jaw dropped, and her face flushed with indignation. "Few days? No file!" Professor Ashtorn ignored her outburst, her focus shifting to me. "And Jessica," she said, her voice firm. "You'll spend the next 2 weeks as a 10-year-old girl again. This was the agreement made earlier, and I intend to uphold it." Clara blinked, her tiny face scrunching in confusion. "What you mean? Why she gotta do that?" My stomach twisted as I realized Clara didn't know about my confession. I avoided her gaze, staring down at the glowing butterfly still resting in my hand. "Come with me, Jessica," Professor Ashtorn ordered, holding out her hand. I hesitated but obeyed, toddling forward on unsteady legs. The rustle of my pull-up and the swish of my frilly dress made every step more humiliating. As I reached her, Professor Ashtorn bent slightly and took my hand. "We're going to have a little chat," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Clara watched us, her confusion giving way to frustration. "Why she leavin'? Why I gotta stay?" Professor Ashtorn straightened, her expression unreadable. "Because this is how things are, Clara," she said simply before leading me out of the nursery. The door clicked shut behind us, leaving Clara's protests muffled inside. Professor Ashtorn walked briskly down the hallway, her grip firm but not harsh. I struggled to keep up with her long strides, my toddler legs wobbling beneath me. "When?" I finally asked, my voice small. She didn't look down at me as she answered, "When I decide you're ready. For now, you will remain in this form." I pouted, tugging slightly at her hand. "Why knows you change me back now?" Professor Ashtorn stopped and turned to face me, her expression severe but calm. "Because you need to understand that there are consequences for your actions, Jessica. You may have confessed, but that doesn't absolve you entirely. Consider this an extended lesson." I let out a frustrated sigh, my voice slipping into the broken toddler speech again. "This dumb." Her lips quirked slightly, almost like she was amused. "Perhaps," she said. "But that's not for you to decide." With that, she continued walking, leading me toward an unknown destination. Despite my embarrassment and frustration, I couldn't help but wonder what awaited me next. Professor Ashtorn led me down the hallway, her hand still holding mine as my toddler-sized legs struggled to keep up with her brisk pace. The halls felt colder now, quieter, as though the very walls knew something important was about to happen. Finally, we stopped in front of a door. Professor Ashtorn flicked her wand, and the door creaked open slowly, revealing a small, simple room with soft lighting and a single chair in the center. But my attention wasn't on the room itself, it was on the figure sitting awkwardly in the chair. A boy! He was small and slender, with short hair that looked freshly cut, as though the style didn't quite belong to him. He wore a girl's tank top and shorts, the same outfit I had seen Emma wearing after she was turned into a baby. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the floor as though he was doing everything in his power to disappear. I froze in the doorway, my tiny hand tightening around Professor Ashtorn's fingers. Is that Emma?" I asked, my voice trembling with both confusion and disbelief. Professor Ashtorn gave a small nod. "Yes, Jessica. That's Emma." The boy looked up sharply at the sound of his name, his face flushing with humiliation. "Don't call me that," he snapped, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm Elliot now." Professor Ashtorn arched an eyebrow but didn't comment. Instead, she stepped aside, gently nudging me into the room. "Go on," she said. "You two have things to discuss." I toddled inside hesitantly, my cheeks burning as I glanced between Professor Ashtorn and the boy, Elliot, who was now glaring at the floor again. The door clicked shut behind me, leaving us alone. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was thick and uncomfortable, like a barrier neither of us wanted to break. Finally, Elliot let out a frustrated sigh, crossing his arms over his chest. "This is your fault," he muttered, his voice low but sharp. I blinked, startled. "My fault? You the one who messed with my head?" Elliot flinched slightly but didn't look up. "I didn't mean for it to go so far," he said quietly. "I just wanted to get back at you for pushing me into the mud. I didn't think." "Didn't think what?" I shot back, my toddler speech making the words clumsier than I intended. "That it was wrong?" Elliot's hands clenched into fists. "I know it was wrong, okay? But that doesn't make this fair." He gestured angrily at himself, his face reddening. "Look at me! This isn't who I am." I crossed my arms, suddenly feeling a flicker of understanding. "Now you know how I feel," I muttered, my voice softer. "Being stuck as someone you use. It's not fun." Elliot's shoulders slumped, his anger fading into something that looked more like shame. "I didn't think about that," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. We sat there in silence again, the tension slowly easing as the weight of our actions hung in the air. Professor Ashtorn's voice cut through the quiet, calm but firm. "This room is not a punishment. It's an opportunity," she said from the other side of the door. "You both need to understand the consequences of your actions, and each other. Apologize. Talk. Find some common ground, and you'll both be allowed to leave." I glanced at Elliot, who was staring at the floor again. "I'm sorry," I said finally, the words awkward but sincere. "For pushing you and making you mad. I shouldn't have done that." Elliot looked up, his eyes meeting mine for the first time. He hesitated, then nodded. "I'm sorry too," he said softly. "For messing with your mind. That was really wrong." We sat there for a moment longer, the apologies lingering in the air like fragile truce flags. From behind the door, Professor Ashtorn's voice carried a faint note of approval. "Good! Now keep talking." And so, we did! Emma sat cross-legged on the floor now, leaning against the chair she had abandoned. Her anger had softened, replaced by something quieter, almost reflective. I sat opposite her, tugging awkwardly at the frilly toddler dress I was still wearing. "Wasn't fair, what I did," Emma admitted after a long pause. "To you, I mean. I don't know what I was thinking. I just wanted you to feel what it's like to be powerless." I nodded slowly, even as the humiliation of the past day bubbled under the surface. "You did that," I said, my toddler voice garbled but still carrying the weight of my words. "But it hurt, more than you know." Emma frowned, her face pale. "I guess I do now." She glanced down at herself, tugging at the hem of the tank top she still wore. Being like this, being someone else, I hated it. As we talked, I noticed something strange happening. Emma's hair, which had been short and boyish, seemed to grow, lengthening slightly until it framed her face the way it used to. Her features softened too, the sharp lines of her jaw fading into a gentler curve. "You changin' back," I said, pointing at her. Emma blinked in surprise, touching her face as if to confirm my observation. "What?" she asked, her voice catching as it shifted subtly, becoming higher and more familiar. I looked down at my own hands and noticed they were growing, the pudginess of my toddler form melting away. My arms and legs lengthened, and the awkward proportions of my body shifted back toward their usual size, but as my body returned to that of a 10-year-old girl, I realized with horror that my clothes didn't change with me. The pink toddler dress now barely covered me, and the pull-up I was wearing felt impossibly tight and uncomfortable. "Ugh," I muttered, shifting awkwardly. "No fit." Emma looked up, her own transformation nearly complete. Her hair was back to its original length, and her clothes, still the same tank top and shorts, now fit her properly again. She tilted her head, watching me struggle with the ill-fitting dress. "Looks like there's something for you over there," she said, pointing to a small chest in the corner of the room. I stumbled, over to the chest, opening it to find a simple but elegant dress folded neatly inside. It was white with pale blue trim, clearly meant for a 10-year-old girl like the one I had become again. "Ugh," I grumbled, pulling the toddler dress over my head and tossing it aside. I slipped into the new dress, the soft fabric fitting perfectly. Emma smirked faintly as she watched. "Better?" I nodded, smoothing the skirt. "Yeah." As we sat back down, our transformations now complete, the room felt lighter somehow. Emma looked at me, her expression softer than it had ever been. "I guess we both messed up, huh?" "Big mess," I agreed, still speaking in my garbled toddler voice. She raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Your voice didn't change back, did it?" I glared at her. "No." For the first time, Emma laughed, a genuine, light-hearted sound that surprised even her. "Well, I guess we're even now," she said, her tone warmer. "Guess so," I muttered, my cheeks flushing slightly. The door creaked open, and Professor Ashtorn stepped inside, her gaze sweeping over us with a faint air of approval. "I see you've both returned to your proper selves," she said. "And I trust you've resolved your differences?" Emma and I exchanged a glance before nodding in unison. "Good," Professor Ashtorn said simply. "Then you may return to your dorms." As Emma and I left the room, side by side, I couldn't help but feel that something had shifted between us. It wasn't exactly a friendship, but it was something better than what we'd had before, a truce, maybe even an understanding. For now, that was enough. The dormitory was quiet as the other girls prepared for bed. The soft rustling of blankets and murmured goodnights filled the air, blending with the dim glow of the enchanted lanterns on the walls. I slipped into my nightgown, the silky fabric brushing against my skin. It was still strange, getting used to these clothes, the dresses, skirts, and now the nightgowns, but at least it felt familiar after the chaos of the day. I walked toward my bed, the soft padding of my feet against the floor echoing in the near silence. As I reached my bunk, I hesitated, my eyes drawn to the bed beside mine. It was empty. The blanket was neatly folded, the pillow untouched. There was no sign of Clara, no quiet muttering about the day, no frustrated grumbles about the frilly clothes or the ridiculous punishment we were both enduring. Because she wasn't here? I sat down on the edge of my bed, staring at the empty bunk next to me. Clara was still in the nursery, spending the night there as part of her extended punishment. I knew she'd be back in a few days, but the thought of sleeping here alone, without her familiar presence, made my chest feel tight. Clara had been with me through everything this weekend. She had planned our revenge, taken the risks, and stood by me even when things fell apart. And now, for the first time, I realized how much I relied on her, not just for her cleverness or her boldness, but for her friendship. I lay back on my bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin. The room felt emptier without her, the quiet too loud. "Miss you, Clara," I whispered softly to the empty bunk. The lanterns dimmed, and the dormitory settled into silence. As I closed my eyes, I promised myself I'd find a way to make things right, not just for myself, but for Clara too.